Picture this. You are crouched behind a marble pillar in the imperial palace of Rome, 39 AD. The scent of burning incense mingles with something far more unsettling, the metallic tang of fear that permeates these hallways. Silk rustles against stone as figures move through the shadows, their whispered conversations carrying fragments of horrors that would make even the gods recoil. The flickering light of oil lamps reveals senators clutching their togas closer, not against the evening chill, but against the knowledge of what transpires behind those gilded doors. You hear laughter, high, manic, utterly without joy. It echoes through corridors where the most powerful men in the world have learned to walk on eggshells, knowing that their emperor's whims have transcended mere cruelty and entered realms that challenge the very nature of human depravity. Welcome back to the Hollow Throne, where we explore the darkest recesses of power's corruption. I'm your host, and today we descend into the twisted psyche of history's most sexually deviant ruler, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula. But before we continue, I must warn you, today's episode contains explicit discussions of sexual violence, incest, torture, and psychological manipulation that may disturb even the most hardened students of history. The man we're about to examine wasn't merely mad. Madness implies a disconnection from reality. Caligula was something far more terrifying, a calculating sadist with absolute power and sexual appetites that would redefine the boundaries of human evil. His 4-year reign would leave Rome traumatized, his own family decimated, and historians struggling to find language adequate to describe what they had witnessed. So steel yourself as we journey into the imperial bedchamber of a monster, where power became the ultimate aphrodisiac, and human suffering the currency of pleasure. This is not merely the story of one man's descent into depravity, it's a cautionary tale about what happens when absolute power meets absolute corruption, creating a perfect storm of sexual terror that would echo through history. Picture this. You are a 3-year-old child in a Roman military camp along the Germanic frontier, 15 AD. The year is marked not by seasons, but by the rhythm of war. The clash of shields, the screams of the dying, and the ever-present smell of blood and smoke. Your father, Germanicus, is Rome's golden general, beloved by his troops and feared by Rome's enemies. But for you, little Gaius, this world of violence is simply home. The soldiers adore you. They've made you tiny military sandals, Caligaius, earning you the nickname Caligula, Little Boot. To them you're a mascot, a symbol of Roman future. They don't yet understand that they're nurturing something that will grow to devour the very empire they serve. But what does constant exposure to violence do to a developing mind? Modern psychology tells us that children who witness extreme brutality often internalize it, normalizing behaviors that should horrify. Young Caligula wasn't just witnessing violence, he was being raised by men who celebrated it, who found entertainment in the suffering of enemies, who measured worth by the ability to inflict pain. Then, in 19 AD, catastrophe. Germanicus dies mysteriously in Syria, possibly poisoned. 6-year-old Caligula watches his mother, Agrippina the Elder, transform from grieving widow into a paranoid, vengeful woman convinced that enemies lurk behind every marble pillar. The imperial court, already a nest of vipers, becomes young Caligula's classroom in manipulation, betrayal, and the strategic use of fear. Picture this. You are now a teenager, brought to the island paradise of Capri to live with your great-uncle, Emperor Tiberius. But Capri in 31 AD is no paradise. It's an island of sexual depravity, where Rome's emperor has retreated to indulge appetites that would shock even the most jaded Roman citizen. Ancient historians whisper of Tiberius's little fishes, young boys trained for the emperor's pleasure. They speak of rooms designed for unspeakable acts, of visitors who arrived as dignified Romans and left as broken shells. And in this environment, teenage Caligula learns the most dangerous lesson of his life, that absolute power means absolute license to indulge every impulse, no matter how twisted. But here's where Caligula differs from a typical victim of abuse. He doesn't break, instead he watches, he learns. He catalogues every technique of psychological manipulation, every method of inspiring terror, every way that power can be weaponized for pleasure. Suetonius tells us that even as a teenager, Caligula could hide his thoughts behind a mask of charm, so perfect that Tiberius never suspected the monster growing in his shadow. When Tiberius dies in 37 AD, possibly with Caligula's assistance, though historians debate this, the 18-year-old who ascends to power is already a master manipulator, who has internalized lessons in cruelty that would take most sadists a lifetime to learn. The Roman people, desperate for relief from Tiberius's paranoid rule, welcome their new emperor with celebration. They have no idea they've just crowned their own nightmare. But power, like wine, reveals character rather than creating it. The sexual appetites and cruel impulses that Caligula had learned to hide were about to be unleashed on an empire that had no defenses against a monster who understood that the ultimate pleasure wasn't just inflicting pain, it was making his victims complicit in their own destruction. The boy who had learned to survive in a world of monsters was about to show Rome what he had truly absorbed from his education in evil. Picture this. You are a Roman citizen in the early months of Caligula's reign, 37 AD. The streets ring with celebration as your new emperor displays what seems like benevolence, releasing political prisoners, giving generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, hosting spectacular games. The contrast with Tiberius's grim final years feels like emerging from a nightmare into sunlight, but those closest to the emperor begin to notice irregularities. Palace servants whisper about strange requests, about orders that make no sense, about a young ruler whose eyes hold depths that seem far older and infinitely more dangerous than his 19 years should allow. The first signs manifest in his private chambers. Ancient sources, particularly Suetonius and Cassius Dio, document how Caligula's sexual behavior quickly evolved beyond mere excess into calculated psychological torture. Where Roman emperors traditionally indulged in straightforward debauchery, Caligula innovated methods that combined physical pleasure with mental destruction. His initial targets were the wives and daughters of Rome's elite. But this wasn't random lust, this was strategic humiliation designed to demonstrate that no Roman, regardless of rank or honor, possessed anything that Caligula couldn't claim. He would publicly announce his intention to bed a senator's wife, forcing the husband to smile and nod approval while inwardly dying of shame and rage. Picture this. You are attending an imperial banquet in 38 AD. Caligula rises from his couch, wine in hand, and begins critiquing the physical attributes of the women present, as if they were livestock at market. He describes in explicit detail what he intends to do with each one, while their husbands and fathers sit frozen, knowing that any objection means death. But the public humiliation was merely the appetizer. What happened in private chambers was where Caligula's true nature revealed itself. Survivors, and there were few who dared speak, described a ruler who treated sexual encounters as opportunities for psychological vivisection, studying his victims' reactions to various forms of degradation with the clinical detachment of a natural philosopher. Palace servants began reporting that screams from the imperial chambers weren't just sounds of passion, but something far more disturbing. Women would emerge from encounters with the emperor, changed, not merely physically violated, but psychologically shattered in ways that suggested systematic psychological torture disguised as sexual activity. Then there was Drusilla, his own sister. Modern historians debate the exact nature of their relationship, but ancient sources leave little doubt that Caligula's sexual obsession with his sister transcended even Roman tolerance for imperial excess. This wasn't mere incest, it was the weaponization of familial bonds for sexual gratification. Suetonius records that Caligula would force Drusilla to participate in sexual acts with others while he watched, not for mere voyeuristic pleasure, but to study the psychological impact of humiliation on someone he claimed to love. He was conducting experiments in the destruction of human dignity, using his own sister as a test subject. The emperor began systematically destroying marriages among the nobility, not through divorce but through psychological contamination. He would seduce wives not for their beauty, but specifically to corrupt relationships that represented stability and honor in Roman society. Each affair was carefully calculated to maximize the psychological damage to all parties involved. His sexual appetites began to merge with his love of spectacle in ways that horrified even Romans accustomed to brutal entertainment. Gladiatorial games became opportunities for sexual display, with the emperor forcing captured enemies' wives and daughters to perform degrading acts as part of the entertainment. But perhaps most disturbing was the clinical detachment with which he approached these horrors. This wasn't the random brutality of a madman, but the systematic experimentation of someone who had learned to find sexual pleasure, not in human connection, but in human destruction. By the end of 38 AD, less than 2 years into his reign, Caligula had established patterns that would define his rule: the use of sexual violence as a tool of political control, the systematic destruction of Roman social bonds, and most terrifyingly, the clinical study of human psychological limits through sexual torture. The honeymoon was over. The real nightmare was about to begin. Picture this. You are a palace servant in 38 AD, tasked with preparing the imperial family's private quarters. But as you arrange the chambers, you notice something that chills your blood. There are no separate bedrooms. The emperor has redesigned the family wing so that he and his 3 sisters share interconnected spaces with no barriers, no privacy, no boundaries between imperial and intimate. Caligula's 3 sisters represented everything beautiful and noble in the Julian bloodline: Drusilla with her legendary beauty, Agrippina with her sharp political intelligence, and Julia Livilla with her artistic talents. To the Roman people, they embodied the hope of imperial continuity. To their brother, they represented something far more sinister: test subjects for his evolving theories of power and sexual control. But this wasn't mere familial abuse. Caligula elevated his sisters to divine status, forcing the Roman people to worship them as goddesses, while simultaneously degrading them through sexual exploitation. He created a twisted theology where divine honors and sexual humiliation coexisted, forcing his sisters to participate in religious ceremonies that were barely disguised orgies. Drusilla bore the worst of his obsession. Ancient historians describe a relationship that transcended normal categories of abuse. Caligula claimed to share a mystical connection with her, insisting that their sexual union was necessary for the spiritual health of the empire. He forced her to participate in public rituals where she was simultaneously worshipped as a goddess and degraded as his personal property. Suetonius records that Caligula would summon all three sisters to his chambers simultaneously, forcing them to witness each other's humiliation. But this wasn't random cruelty. He was systematically destroying the bonds of trust and affection between them, ensuring that they couldn't unite against him while studying how family relationships could be weaponized for sexual gratification. Agrippina the Younger, future mother of Nero, responded differently than her sisters. She learned to manipulate the situation, using her brother's obsession to gain political influence while internally calculating her revenge. Her survival strategy would later inform her own twisted approach to power, creating a cycle of sexual manipulation that would plague the imperial family for generations. The Roman Senate found itself in an impossible position. They were forced to publicly honor the emperor's sisters as goddesses, while privately knowing they were victims of systematic sexual abuse. Senators had to participate in religious ceremonies celebrating Drusilla's divinity, while understanding that she was being psychologically destroyed by her own brother. Caligula instituted new religious festivals, where his sisters were required to perform acts that combined divine worship with sexual exhibition. Roman citizens were forced to participate in ceremonies that violated every traditional boundary between sacred and profane, creating a state-sponsored religion centered on imperial incest. When Drusilla died in 38 AD, possibly from the psychological and physical toll of sustained abuse, Caligula's reaction revealed the true depth of his psychological disturbance. He declared her a goddess, instituted official periods of mourning that resembled lover's grief more than brotherly sorrow, and made it treason to show insufficient sorrow for her death. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Caligula's grief wasn't just for a lost sister or even a sexual partner. It was for the loss of his primary victim, the person whose psychological destruction had provided him with the most sophisticated pleasure. Her death represented the loss of his most refined instrument of psychological torture. In desperate attempts to replace what he had lost, Caligula began seeking women who resembled Drusilla, forcing them into sexual relationships that were explicitly designed to recreate his sister's psychological destruction. But these substitutes only highlighted what he had lost. Years of careful psychological conditioning that couldn't be replicated. His surviving sisters, Agrippina and Julia Livilla, found themselves trapped in an escalating nightmare. With Drusilla's death, Caligula's sexual attention focused more intensely on them, but now seasoned with the additional perversion of forcing them to participate in memorial rituals for their dead sister that were barely disguised sexual reenactments. The systematic sexual abuse of the imperial family had effects that rippled throughout Roman society. Noble families began to fear that their own daughters might be chosen as imperial concubines, while the moral authority of the imperial house collapsed under the weight of publicly acknowledged perversion. By 39 AD, Caligula had transformed incest from a private shame into a public institution, creating a template for imperial sexual behavior that would haunt Rome for generations. But his appetite for sexual innovation was far from satisfied. The destruction of his own family had merely been practice for the systematic sexual terrorization of the entire Roman Empire. The next phase would make his treatment of his sisters seem almost merciful by comparison. Picture this. You are a Roman citizen entering the Circus Maximus for what you believe will be traditional gladiatorial games, 39 AD. The sand has been freshly raked, the crowd buzzes with anticipation, and the emperor's box gleams with purple and gold. But as you take your seat, you notice something unsettling. There are far too many wealthy women in the arena's holding areas, and their expressions aren't those of spectators, but of condemned prisoners. Caligula had revolutionized the gladiatorial games, but not in ways that enhanced their martial honor. Instead, he had transformed Rome's most sacred entertainment into a theater of sexual humiliation designed to demonstrate that no Roman family, regardless of wealth or status, possessed anything he couldn't claim and corrupt for his amusement. The games began traditionally enough, professional gladiators fighting with skill and honor. But then came Caligula's innovations. Captured enemy leaders' wives and daughters were forced to perform degrading acts as intermission entertainment, while their husbands and fathers were compelled to watch from the stands, their shame displayed for the amusement of hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens. But the emperor's attention wasn't on the spectacle itself, it was on the faces of the victims' family members in the crowd. Ancient sources describe how Caligula would use mirrors and reflecting surfaces to study the expressions of fathers watching their daughters' degradation, mothers witnessing their sons' humiliation, husbands seeing their wives' violation. The most psychologically devastating innovation was forcing Roman nobility to participate directly. Senators were commanded to send their wives and daughters to serve as attendants in the games, knowing that this service would involve sexual acts performed for the entertainment of the mob. Refusal meant not just death but the sexual torture of every female member of their family. Caligula established special training schools where captured enemies and condemned criminals were taught not just combat skills but sexual techniques designed to maximize the psychological impact on victims. These weren't gladiator schools, they were academies of sexual torture, staffed by the empire's most creative sadists. Perhaps most terrifying was Caligula's practice of randomly selecting audience members during the games to participate in impromptu sexual exhibitions. A gesture from the imperial box could transform a respectable Roman matron into an unwilling performer in front of her own children, friends, and social circle. But the public humiliation was merely the opening act. Those selected for imperial attention were taken to private chambers beneath the arena where Caligula conducted what can only be described as sexual experiments, systematic studies of human psychological breaking points, using techniques that combined physical torture with sexual violation. These subterranean chambers became laboratories where the emperor tested theories about human nature that would make modern psychologists recoil. He wanted to understand exactly how much psychological pressure was needed to make victims complicit in their own degradation, how family bonds could be turned into weapons of torture, and how sexual violation could be used to destroy not just individuals but entire social structures. Survivors of these encounters, when there were survivors, emerged fundamentally changed. They were forced to return to their normal lives, to interact with their families and friends, while carrying the knowledge of horrors that they could never speak about. The emperor had created walking psychological time bombs, scattered throughout Roman society. The sexual gladiatorial games had effects that rippled far beyond their immediate victims. Roman families began to live in constant fear that any public appearance might result in selection for imperial attention. The basic social bonds that held Roman civilization together, marriage, family honor, parental protection, began to dissolve under the stress of knowing that all could be violated at the emperor's whim. Most insidiously, Caligula began incorporating religious elements into his sexual gladiatorial games, claiming that the degradation of enemies and rebels was a form of sacrifice to the gods. He forced Roman priests to sanctify what were essentially public gang rapes, creating a theological justification for sexual torture that corrupted the very spiritual foundations of Roman society. Perhaps most disturbing was how quickly Roman citizens adapted to these horrors. What initially shocked audiences into silence eventually became normalized entertainment. The emperor had successfully corrupted the moral sensibilities of an entire civilization, training hundreds of thousands of people to find pleasure in systematic sexual torture. By 40 AD, the sexual gladiatorial games had become the centerpiece of Roman entertainment, with each event pushing boundaries further than the last. But Caligula's appetite for innovation was insatiable. The corruption of public entertainment was merely preparing the ground for his most ambitious project, the complete sexual subjugation of the Roman Empire. The arena had become his testing ground. Now he was ready to apply those lessons to an entire civilization. Picture this. You are an architect summoned to redesign the imperial palace in 40 AD. The emperor's requirements are unusual. He wants a wing that can house hundreds of women, but not as traditional concubines. The specifications include observation rooms, chambers designed for multiple occupants, and most disturbing of all, quarters for the women's family members, who will be forced to witness their degradation. Caligula had evolved beyond random sexual predation into something far more systematic, the creation of an imperial harem designed not for pleasure, but for the scientific study of sexual and psychological torture. His agents scoured the empire, selecting women not just for beauty, but for their family connections, social status, and psychological profiles that would maximize the impact of their degradation. The selection process itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Women were chosen specifically because their violation would cause maximum pain to their families and communities. A general's daughter, a senator's wife, a merchant's beloved daughter. Each selection was calculated to destroy not just an individual but entire networks of relationships and social bonds. The imperial harem wasn't a traditional Eastern-style pleasure house. It was designed as a research facility where Caligula could conduct long-term studies of human psychological deterioration under conditions of sustained sexual abuse. The women lived in luxury, silk clothes, fine food, beautiful surroundings, while being subjected to systematic dehumanization that was all the more horrifying for its clinical precision. Ancient sources describe a bureaucracy of sexual terror, detailed records of each woman's psychological responses, careful schedules designed to maximize trauma, and systematic documentation of which techniques were most effective at destroying different personality types. This wasn't random brutality. It was organized research using human beings as experimental subjects. The most psychologically devastating aspect was Caligula's requirement that family members participate in their loved ones' degradation. Fathers were forced to deliver their daughters personally. Husbands had to prepare their wives for imperial attention, and mothers were compelled to watch their children's psychological destruction while maintaining expressions of gratitude for the honor of imperial selection. Caligula maintained what can only be described as research notes on each victim's psychological deterioration. He studied how different social backgrounds affected responses to abuse, which family bonds could be most effectively weaponized, and how sexual torture could be calibrated to achieve specific psychological outcomes without causing immediate death. The harem required hundreds of staff members, guards, servants, administrators, all of whom became complicit in the systematic sexual torture of Roman citizens. But this complicity wasn't accidental, it was carefully cultivated. Staff members were gradually introduced to increasingly horrific duties. Their moral sensibilities slowly eroded until they could participate in unspeakable acts while maintaining their self-image as loyal imperial servants. Those women who survived their time in the imperial harem were released back to their families as living weapons designed to destroy Roman social structures. They carried with them psychological trauma that made normal relationships impossible, but more insidiously, they had been trained to normalize sexual violence, spreading the emperor's corruption throughout Roman society like a psychological plague. Ancient historians working from palace records discovered after Caligula's death describe detailed documentation of torture techniques, victim responses, and innovative methods for maximizing psychological damage. The emperor had created the ancient world's first systematic study of sexual torture, treating human suffering as a subject for scientific inquiry. To legitimize his actions, Caligula instituted religious ceremonies claiming that the sexual subjugation of Roman women was necessary for the empire's spiritual health. He forced priests to declare that the emperor's sexual practices were divine commandments, creating theological justifications for systematic sexual torture that corrupted Roman religious institutions. As 40 AD progressed, the harem expanded to include increasingly vulnerable populations, children of condemned enemies, elderly women from rebellious families, even disabled individuals who could provide no physical pleasure but whose degradation offered psychological satisfaction to an emperor whose appetites had transcended normal human categories. The imperial harem's effects rippled throughout Roman society in ways that threatened the very foundations of civilization. Marriage became a source of terror rather than joy, parenthood a potential death sentence, and social advancement a pathway to victimization. Caligula had successfully weaponized sexuality to attack the basic structures that held human society together. But systematic sexual terror, no matter how carefully organized, eventually creates its own resistance. By 40 AD, the survivors of Caligula's sexual experiments were beginning to find each other, to share their experiences, and to plan revenge. The emperor's most refined instrument of control was becoming the foundation of his destruction. The imperial harem had become too successful, it had created too many enemies, destroyed too many powerful families, and corrupted too many institutions. The systematic sexual terrorization of the Roman Empire was approaching a breaking point that would threaten not just Caligula's reign, but his very life. The monster had grown too large to contain, and Rome was preparing to strike back. Picture this. You are a Praetorian guard in early 41 AD, standing watch outside the emperor's chambers. The sounds emerging from within no longer resemble human voices. They're something else entirely, a mixture of laughter, screaming, and what can only be described as the vocalizations of a creature that has transcended human categories of sanity or madness. 3.5 years of systematic sexual torture had transformed Caligula from a young emperor into something that challenged the boundaries of human appearance. Ancient sources describe a figure whose eyes held no trace of normal human emotion, whose smile had become a rictus of predatory anticipation, and whose very presence in a room caused experienced soldiers to unconsciously reach for their weapons. By 41 AD, Caligula's sexual appetites had evolved beyond anything recognizable as human desire. He began demanding that victims recreate increasingly impossible scenarios, historical reenactments of mythological rapes, complex psychological tortures that required months of preparation, and sexual spectacles that pushed the boundaries of what human bodies could survive. The palace itself had become a source of psychological contagion. Servants who had witnessed the emperor's activities began displaying symptoms that modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe PTSD, nightmares, dissociation, and an inability to form normal human relationships. The very air within the imperial residence seemed contaminated with trauma. The Roman Senate had been reduced to a collection of traumatized survivors whose primary concern was no longer governance, but simple survival. Senators avoided eye contact with the emperor, spoke only when directly addressed, and lived in constant terror that they or their family members might be selected for imperial attention. But trauma, when shared among enough people, eventually transforms into something more dangerous, collective rage. The survivors of Caligula's sexual experiments began to find each other, and what they discovered was that they shared not just suffering, but a burning desire for revenge that transcended normal Roman concepts of justice. The conspiracy that would end Caligula's reign wasn't motivated by political ideology or personal ambition. It was driven by the accumulated trauma of hundreds of people who had been sexually tortured, psychologically destroyed, and forced to watch their loved ones suffer unspeakable degradation. This was vengeance in its purest form. Caligula's last documented sexual activities suggest a complete break from even the most elastic definitions of sanity. He began conducting elaborate ceremonies where he claimed to be copulating with the gods themselves, forcing palace staff to participate in rituals that combined sexual violence with religious blasphemy on a scale that horrified even his most jaded courtiers. Picture this. It is January 24, 41 AD. You are attending what appears to be a normal day of imperial entertainment, theatrical performances celebrating Roman culture. But beneath the surface, the accumulated rage of 3.5 years of sexual terror is about to explode into an act of violence that will echo through history. Cassius Chaerea, the Praetorian Guard officer leading the conspiracy, had personally witnessed horrors that no human being should ever see. His motivation wasn't political, it was deeply personal. Caligula had forced him to participate in the sexual torture of people Chaerea had sworn to protect, and the psychological weight of that complicity had transformed a loyal soldier into an avenging angel. When the conspirators struck, their violence wasn't clean or clinical, it was the explosion of years of repressed trauma and rage. They stabbed Caligula 30 times, far beyond what was necessary for death, each wound representing the accumulated suffering of victims who could never strike back themselves. The assassination unleashed a fury that went beyond simple regime change. The conspirators immediately began dismantling Caligula's entire apparatus of sexual terror, destroying records, liberating victims, and executing staff members who had been too enthusiastic in their participation in imperial atrocities. In the palace archives, the conspirators discovered documentation that revealed the true scope of what had been happening, detailed records of sexual experiments, psychological studies of victim responses, and systematic plans for expanding the sexual terrorization of the empire that would have made the previous 3 years seem mild by comparison. When Claudius was proclaimed emperor, he inherited not just a throne, but a traumatized empire. His first acts weren't political reforms, but massive efforts to provide support for the survivors of his nephew's sexual reign of terror, medical care, financial compensation, and most importantly, the assurance that such horrors would never be permitted again. But the damage couldn't be easily repaired. Caligula's sexual reign of terror had corrupted fundamental Roman institutions, the military, the priesthood, the Senate, and even basic family structures. The psychological trauma he inflicted rippled through generations, affecting not just direct victims, but their children and grandchildren. Later emperors and historians attempted to suppress the full details of Caligula's sexual crimes, not out of respect for his memory, but because the truth was so horrifying that it threatened the legitimacy of the imperial system itself. Much of what we know comes from fragments that survived systematic attempts at historical sanitization. Picture this. You are walking through modern Rome, past the ruins of the Circus Maximus where Caligula conducted his sexual gladiatorial games. The stones remember what happened here. The screams, the trauma, the systematic destruction of human dignity in service of one man's twisted appetites. But do we? The story of Caligula's sexual reign of terror offers lessons that transcend ancient history. This wasn't simply the tale of one mad emperor, it was a case study in how absolute power, when combined with systematic sexual predation, can corrupt entire civilizations and create trauma that echoes through generations. Modern psychology helps us understand what ancient historians could only describe, how Caligula's childhood trauma, exposure to systematic abuse, and early education in manipulation created a perfect storm of sexual sadism amplified by unlimited political power. His story represents the ultimate cautionary tale about what happens when damaged individuals gain absolute authority over others. The patterns we see in Caligula's reign, the systematic nature of the abuse, the institutional complicity, the psychological destruction of victims, and the long-term social damage, mirror what we now understand about institutional sexual abuse in modern contexts. The methods may change, but the underlying dynamics remain tragically consistent across millennia. Perhaps most importantly, Caligula's story demonstrates why no individual, regardless of their position or power, should ever be placed beyond accountability for their sexual conduct. The Roman system's inability to constrain imperial behavior created conditions where sexual predation could evolve into systematic torture without meaningful resistance. But there is hope in this darkness. The conspiracy that ended Caligula's reign proves that even the most sophisticated systems of sexual terror ultimately create their own resistance. Human dignity, though it can be suppressed and violated, cannot be permanently destroyed. it finds ways to strike back, to seek justice, and to rebuild what has been corrupted. If you found today's exploration of history's darkest chapter enlightening, please subscribe to the Hollow Throne for more investigations into power's corruption. Next week, we'll examine how Caligula's nephew Nero learned from his uncle's mistakes to create new forms of imperial sexual terror that would make even Caligula's crimes seem restrained by comparison. Remember, those who forget history's darkest lessons are condemned to repeat them. The Hollow Throne of absolute power will always attract those who would abuse it, and only through understanding these patterns can we hope to prevent their recurrence. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and never forget that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against those who would corrupt it for their own twisted pleasures.